Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Gopinath, Radha Gopinath, Shri Radhe. Jaya Jagannatha, Jaya Jagannatha, Jaya Baladeva, Jaya Subhadramai. Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Gauranitai. Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parishara Stotra Sata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Shilasi Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Gantraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Entai Gaur Pemanande Hari Hari Bol Om Vishnupad Dusam Samutana Shantamata Samutana Chavana Shantra Bhakta Chavana Tamata Rimsa Savishnama. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter number 6, titled The Creation of the Universal Form. Text number 36. Tatapi kirta yami anga. Tatapi kirta yami anga. Yata mati yata shrutam. Yata mati yata shrutam. Kirtim hare swam satkartum. Kirtim hare swam satkartum. Giram anya bidhasatim. Giram anya bidhasatim. Tatapi kirtayami anga. Yatha mati yatha shrutam kirtim hare swam satkartum giram anya bhidasatim tatapi kirtayam anga yatha mati yatha shrutam kirtim hare swam satkartum giram anya bhidasatim Tatati kirtam yamanga yatamati yatashrutam kirtim hare samsatkartum giram anya bhidasatim. Word for word translation. Tata, therefore, api, although it is so, kirtayami, I do describe, anga, O Vidura, yata, as much as, mati, intelligence, yata, as much as, shrutam, heard, kirtim, glories, hare, of the Lord, swam, own, satkartum, just to purify, giram, speeches, anya bida, otherwise, asatim, unchaste. Translation purport by His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation. In spite of my inability, whatever I have been able to hear from the spiritual master and whatever I could assimilate, I am now describing in glorification of the Lord by pure speech. For otherwise, my power of speaking would remain unchaste. Purport. The purification of the conditioned soul necessitates purification of his consciousness. By the presence of consciousness, the presence of the transcendental soul is verified. And as soon as consciousness leaves the body, the material body is not active. Consciousness is perceived, therefore, by activities. The theory put forward by empiric philosophers that consciousness can remain in an inactive state is the proof of their poor fund of knowledge. One should not become unchaste by stopping the activities of pure consciousness. If the activities of pure consciousness are stopped, certainly the conscious living force will be otherwise engaged, because unless engaged, the consciousness has no standing. Consciousness cannot be silent, even for a moment. When the body does not act, the consciousness acts in the form of dreams. Unconsciousness is artificial. By induced extraneous help, it remains for a limited period. But when the intoxication of the drug is finished, or when one is awake, the consciousness again acts earnestly. Maitreya's statement is that in order to avoid unchaste, conscious activities, he was trying to describe the unlimited glories of the Lord, although he did not have the ability to describe them perfectly. This glorification of the Lord is not a product of research, but the result of hearing submissively from the authority of the spiritual master. It is also not possible to repeat all that one has heard from his spiritual master, but one can narrate as far as possible by one's honest endeavor. It does not matter whether the Lord's glories are fully explained or not. One must attempt to engage one's bodily, mental, and verbal activities in the transcendental glorification of the Lord. Otherwise, such activities will remain unchaste and impure. The existence of the conditioned soul can be purified only by the method of engaging mind and speech in the service of the Lord. the Tridandi sannyasi of the Vaishnava school accepts 3 rods, representing the vow to engage in the service of the Lord with body, mind and speech, whereas the Ekadanda sannyasi takes the vow to become one with the Supreme. Since the Lord is the Absolute, there is no distinction between Him and His glories. The glories of the Lord, as chanted by the Vaishnava sannyasi, are as substantial as the Lord Himself. And thus, while glorifying the Lord, the devotee becomes one with Him in transcendental interest, although he remains eternally a transcendental servitor. This simultaneously one and different position of the devotee makes him eternally purified, and thus his life becomes a complete success. Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chaksul Metam Yena Tasmei Shri Guruve Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So continuing on our discussion from the 6th chapter of Canto 3, titled The Creation of the Universal Form. So previously this chapter we saw how Vidura he comes and takes shelter of Maitreya Muni, and he puts forward different questions towards Maitreya Muni. And one of the questions was in relation to the creation of the material cosmos. And in this chapter we saw, and in the previous chapter, Maitreya Rishi describing how the creation of the material universe took place. First we saw descriptions of the Mahavishnu. In the previous chapter, how he glanced upon material nature. And in this chapter we were seeing how the Virat Rupa is manifested. And now after having described all this, Maitreya Rishi, he is speaking this verse to Vidura. I'll read the translation again for today's verse. So this is text 36. So this is Maitreya Rishi speaking to Vidura after he's described or finished describing about the initial creation of the material universe. In spite of my inability, whatever I have been able to hear from the spiritual master and whatever I could assimilate, I am now describing in glorification of the Lord by pure speech, for otherwise my power of speaking would remain unchaste. So Maitreya Rishi, after speaking all of this, detailed descriptions about the creation of the material universe, he is saying that actually I'm limited in how much I can describe. He's saying in spite of my inability, that in one sense I'm incapable of fully describing, but in the other sense I'm just, whatever I've been speaking is just simply whatever I heard from my spiritual master. And in the purport, Prabhupada, he's just focusing on this one point, how the student or the disciple, he needs to be chaste to the spiritual master, and whatever the student or the disciple speaks, it's always whatever he's learned from his Guru Maharaj or his spiritual master. And we'll see this point emphasized again and again in the Bhagavatam, that there will always be two personalities. One will be asking the questions and the other one will be answering the questions. And after the question is put forward, we'll see different speakers. In response to that question, many times you'll see that in giving the answer, they'll just refer to another conversation that took place in the history. That the same question that you're asking now was asked, many years ago by this personality to this personality, and this was the response given. And in this way, the parampara system goes on. And if one doesn't follow this parampara system, Maitreya Rishi is saying that if I didn't repeat to you, Vidura, whatever I learned from my spiritual master, then whatever I would be speaking to you won't be pure. And secondly, whatever I would be speaking to you would be unchaste. My power of speech won't be pure, and my power of speech would be unchaste. So for our speech or for our glorification of the Lord, for our preaching to be pure and for our preaching to be effective, and for our preaching to be chaste, according to Maitreya Rishi, one just simply has to repeat whatever he has heard from his spiritual master. Otherwise, as we were hearing yesterday, that we all have imperfect senses, so if we don't take pure bona fide knowledge, which is coming directly from the Shastras, which is faultless, or from a pure devotee, who again just simply repeats whatever is in the Shastra, then if we just simply talk based on our own mindset, then because we're imperfect, we have imperfect senses, the things that we're speaking and giving to other persons will be imperfect. There's bound to be certain errors and faults in that speech. So the speech won't be pure, the speech won't be fully potent. And also, another aspect Maitreya Rishi is saying is that our power of speech should be unchaste. So we'll talk a bit about this, about chastity today also. So just like we know in Vedic culture, this term chastity is in relation to the wife, in relation to her husband. And chastity is like a sign of gratitude. The husband, he gives protection to the wife and takes care of her, supplies all necessities. So the wife in return, she is very chaste, and very chastely she serves her husband. If she doesn't do this, then she's looked down upon in Vedic culture, and one would see her as very ungrateful, because on one hand she's taking all these services coming from her husband, but from her side she's not offering, she's not being chaste to her husband. So in the same way, the Shastras explain that wherever we are in our spiritual lives, it's all simply due to the mercy of our spiritual masters. So anything we're doing now, just like now we're all engaged in devotional service, we're all engaged in hearing and chanting about Krishna, chanting the holy name, we're engaged here in this temple. Where does this all come from? It's all coming from the mercy of Prabhupada. If it wasn't for Prabhupada, we wouldn't be chanting Hare Krishna. If it wasn't for Prabhupada, we wouldn't be reading Srimad Bhagavatam. If it wasn't for Prabhupada, we wouldn't have Shri Shri Radha Gopinath, we wouldn't have these temples. And so in this way, the student or the disciple, he is indebted to the spiritual master. So if he's actually indebted, if he's actually feeling grateful for the spiritual master, naturally he has to show that gratitude, indebtedness through action. And one of these actions by which the disciple can show his gratitude towards the spiritual master, Maitreya Rishi is saying, is that we just simply repeat whatever we've learned from our spiritual master. If we don't simply repeat whatever we've heard from our spiritual master, if we concoct our own things, then that's being unchaste to the Guru, that's being ungrateful for the Guru. And Ghanshyam Prabhu, in some recent classes, he was helping us understand the gravity of what the spiritual master is doing for us. One time, some disciples of Srila Prabhupada, they came up to him and said, Prabhupada, we've heard you've said this before, that the spiritual master has an eternal relationship with the disciple. And that if the disciple, he doesn't go back to Godhead in this lifetime, then because the relationship is eternal, the spiritual master has to keep coming down again and again until the disciple is delivered. Is this actually true, Srila Prabhupada? Like this, the disciples of Prabhupada, they asked Prabhupada this question. And then Prabhupada replied, yes, this is true. That until the disciple goes back home, back to Godhead, the spiritual master has to keep on taking birth in order to reclaim back his disciple back to the spiritual world. And then Prabhupada says, please don't make me come again. Like this Prabhupada says. So it's a very serious business that the spiritual master takes. Ghanshyam Prabhu was mentioning that at initiation, all of the sinful reactions that we've accumulated, not just in this lifetime, for countless lifetimes, the spiritual master, he agrees to accept during the time of initiation. So if someone is doing that for us, someone is doing that for me and you, then how much grateful or how much eternally indebted we must be to them. That all of the sinful reactions we've accumulated through all of our lifetimes, the spiritual master, he readily accepts at the time of initiation. And that's why Ghanshyam Prabhu was mentioning that we shouldn't take our Diksha Guru for granted. Prabhu was mentioning that many times we'll take Diksha from a particular spiritual master, and that spiritual master will take all of our sins. But then when it comes to practicing our spiritual life, we'll go and take Siksha from everyone else except for our own Diksha Guru. Whatever our own Diksha Guru says, we'll take it lightly, won't fully follow. and instead we'll go take Siksha from everyone else. And Ghanshyam Prabhu was mentioning that this is, again, us being very ungrateful to the spiritual master. Because here's someone who is taking all of the sinful reactions of us for many countless of lifetimes. Who else would do that for us? So if someone's doing such a great thing for us, naturally if we are actually chaste to them, naturally if we're grateful to them, at least we can follow what they're saying. But instead, Ghanshyam Prabhu is saying that many times we see devotees, they'll ignore what their Diksha Guru says, and instead they'll take Siksha from everyone else. But no, if one is actually grateful, one is actually chaste towards his spiritual master, his Diksha Guru, then he needs to follow the instructions also. In this way, one can attempt to repay his debt. According to the Bhagavatam, it's mentioned that it's actually impossible to repay the debt one has towards his spiritual master. But one should still try, Prabhupada says. Prabhupada explains that although it's impossible for you all to repay your debt to me, but you can still attempt, you can still try by doing what I'm doing, by helping me, by assisting me in spreading this movement. Just like I'm preaching vigorously, in the same way you also preach vigorously, and you assist me in spreading the movement, in this way you can attempt to repay your debt to me. According to, in one section Bhagavatam, it's mentioned that if anyone thinks that he can repay his debt towards his spiritual master, then that person is just a joker, or that person is just a jerk. In this way the Bhagavatam explains that we can never actually repay our debt to the spiritual master. And in the first part of the translation, Maitreya Muni, he's first explaining that actually, in spite of my inability, whatever I've been able to hear from the spiritual master and whatever I could assimilate, I am now describing. So on one hand, Prabhupada will also explain this in a purport, that certain, like spiritual, in terms of discussing or describing spiritual topics, to describe them fully is actually impossible. Just like we see in Chaitanya Charitamrita, the description is given of Anantashesh, Lord Anantashesh. He has thousands and thousands of mouths. And with these thousands and thousands of mouths, he's been describing the glories of Krishna since time immemorial. For countless numbers of years, millions and billions of years, Lord Anantashesh, with thousands and thousands of mouths, has been describing the glories of Lord. But still he hasn't come to the end of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's pastime. Still he hasn't come to the end of describing Krishna's glories. So it's actually impossible to describe the glories of the Lord. And in the same way, Sukadeva Goswami in 5th Canto Bhagavatam, he explains that actually it's impossible to fully describe how this whole material universe is working. And the same thing Maitreya Rishi is saying, that actually it's impossible to fully describe the creation and how everything is working. But whatever I could understand from my spiritual master, I'm repeating to you, as to the best of my capability. And in the purport, Prabhupada explains that this glorification of the Lord is not a product of research, but the result of hearing submissively from the authority of the spiritual master. It is also not possible to repeat all that one has heard from his spiritual master, but one can narrate as far as possible by one's honest endeavor. So again, Prabhupada is saying, okay, we have to be chaste to the spiritual master, we have to learn from him, and we have to repeat whatever we've heard from our spiritual masters, and we shouldn't concoct anything new, because that would be being ungrateful, and that would be being unchaste. But repeating whatever we've learned from our Guru Maharaj doesn't mean that we remember everything word for word, exactly whatever they said, memorize everything, and repeat everything verbatim. Prabhupada is saying, it is also not possible to repeat all that one has heard from his spiritual masters. Prabhupada is saying, it's impossible to repeat everything that we've learned from our spiritual master word for word. That's not possible. But one can narrate as far as possible by one's honest endeavor. So from our side, we hear from our spiritual master, and whatever we can remember, whatever we can assimilate to the best of that ability, to that extent we can repeat to others. So it's not that one has to be, have super memory and just memorize, every lecture you listen to Prabhupada, or every lecture we listen to our spiritual master, we memorize every single word, every single line and repeat that. No, whatever we can remember to the best of ability, Prabhupada is saying, you just repeat. Another section in his purports, Prabhupada explains that during Prabhupada's times, Prabhupada would explain to his devotees that it's not that we shouldn't think that to become a preacher, one has to, practice for this many years, one has to come to this level, or only after one has read all these books, only after one has memorized this many slokas or done this or that. No, Prabhupada says, whatever you know, you just simply preach. It's not that, okay, you have to do Bhakti Shastri, or you have to finish reading this book, or only after you memorize 20 slokas, or only after you've been in the movement for 5 years. Prabhupada says that doesn't matter where you are or what you're doing, whatever little you know about Krishna, you just simply preach. And that's the instruction of Mahaprabhu. Yare deko, tare ko, Krishna Pades, Amar Agyan Guru hoy, tare desh. Prabhupada, one time he had Saraswati, the daughter of Shamasundar Prabhu, and Prabhupada would ask Saraswati, and she was just a little girl, 2, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, and Prabhupada would ask her that, Saraswati, who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead? And Saraswati would say, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Prabhupada would look at her and smile so nicely, being so pleased with her, and Prabhupada would say, just look at her, she's such a big preacher. So even a 5-year-old, even a 4-year-old, according to Prabhupada, can be a big preacher, if according to the 5-year-old's ability, she just preaches or he just preaches, whatever little they know. So even if a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old is saying that Krishna is Supreme Personality of Godhead, Prabhupada gives them credit that this is a preacher of Mahaprabhu. And other times Prabhupada, he would have some big scholars and professors come to him. And some of these scholars, they would be teachers or professors of Hinduism or Vedic studies in university. And Prabhupada would ask them that who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead? And these so-called professors of Hinduism or Vedic studies, instead of giving a straight answer that Krishna is Supreme Personality of Godhead, they will beat around the bush and talk about everything except for Krishna. And Prabhupada would say, just see, this person is at university, so many students are under him, so many students are coming, taking shelter of him to learn about, our Vedic culture, and he doesn't even know that Krishna is Supreme Personality of Godhead. What is the use of all his studies? What is the use of all his education? Better than him is our Saraswati. In this way, Prabhupada would glorify Saraswati. That even though Saraswati is just 3, 4 years old, 5 years old, if I ask her who's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, immediately she says Krishna is Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this way Prabhupada would chastise these so-called scholars, saying that this 5-year-old girl is much more intelligent, is much more advanced than these so-called professors at universities. So in this way Prabhupada explains that to be a preacher, there's no qualification. We just, whatever little we know, we just simply preach and we just share that with others for the benefit of others. And it will never, Prabhupada is explaining in this purport, we'll never come to the point where we can just memorize everything. But we try and hear from the spiritual master submissively, whatever little we can gather, we remember that, we apply that in our lives, and we share those instructions with others. In this way, one can be an ideal, chaste disciple of his spiritual master. An example of this we see in, like we were hearing recently from the CC classes by Ghanshyam Prabhu, the example of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. On one hand, we'll see in Chaitanya Charitamrita that Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he will show very intense humility. In certain verses of CC, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he will introduce himself, or he will call himself that I'm actually, my position is such that I am lower than the worm in a stool. And he will also say that I'm such a sinful personality that if anyone simply chants my name, then all sinful reactions will come to him. And if anyone hears my name, all of the punya that he has done will all fly away from him. In this way, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, he introduces himself in CC. So on one hand, he's putting himself in such a lowly position due to extreme humility. But on the other hand, we were reading this week in CC, at the start of Madhya Lila, in one verse, he writes that whatever I am writing here in this book, Chaitanya Charitamrita, is completely faultless. Now, this seems contradictory. On one hand, he is saying that I am the most low and fallen, I am so sinful, I am so degraded, I have no good qualities. On the other hand, he is writing in CC, start of Madhya Lila, that whatever I am writing in this book is completely faultless. So how can we understand this? If we read the full translation, he explains that whatever I am writing is faultless because I am simply repeating whatever I have heard from my spiritual masters. Whatever Srila Raghunath Das Goswami, I heard from him, I am simply writing exactly as it is, without adding and without subtracting anything from the pure message. And because I'm simply repeating whatever I have heard from my spiritual masters, whatever I'm writing is faultless, and therefore everyone should take shelter of this. So this is the mood of all disciples, that they understand, on one hand, so there's these two things. On one hand, they see themselves as very fallen, as having no qualification. But on the other hand, they have great pride, and they understand the value or the greatness of their spiritual masters, and they take pride in that. So there's spiritual pride also in spiritual life. So on one hand, the Vaishnava, he doesn't have any mature pride, he doesn't have any pride in his own endeavors, he has a very low conception of in himself. But on the other hand, he also has great pride in his spiritual teachers, in his spiritual masters, and he has great pride in his Guru Parampara. And he has that faith, he has that conviction, he has that confidence. And where is that confidence and conviction coming from? His confidence and conviction is coming from the fact of the greatness of his spiritual masters. So it's not that Vaishnavas, because they're very humble, they have very low self-esteem, they're not very confident, and they don't preach very boldly. No, Vaishnavas, on one hand they're very humble, on the other hand they're very confident, and they preach very boldly. But that bold preaching, that confidence which comes out in their preaching is not coming due to their own ability or due to their own conception of themselves as being great, but that self-esteem, that confidence, that pride comes from their spiritual masters. They understand that my spiritual master, I'm not perfect, I am fallen, but my spiritual master, he is a pure devotee of the Lord, whatever he says is perfect, so if I repeat whatever he says, my preaching will have value. So in this way, Krishnaraj Kaviraj Goswami, again he's showing the ideal mood of a spiritual, of a speaker of Krishna Katha, of a preacher of Krishna Katha. There's two aspects. One is he's humble, he doesn't think highly of himself, but on the other hand, he has that pride, he has that confidence in the message which is coming down through disciplic succession. And in speaking or preaching this message which is coming down through disciplic succession, as Prabhupada is saying, there's only a certain, due to our limited capacity, there's only certain information we can gather, and whatever we can gather, we can repeat. And again, Prabhupada at the start of first canto, he explains that when we repeat this message, another responsibility of the preacher is, one responsibility is that he has to be chaste. He can't add or subtract anything. He has to give the message as it is. But another additional responsibility of the preacher, Prabhupada explains in first canto, is that he has to package the message in such a way that the audience to which he is preaching to can easily digest it. And Prabhupada explains this at the first chapter of first canto of Bhagavatam. If you remember the famous verse, the third verse of first canto, Nigama Kalpataru Galitam Phalam Sukha Mukhamrita Drava Samyutam Pibata Bhagavatam Rasamalayam Muhuraho Rasika Bhuvi Bhavakaha. So in this verse, Vedavyas, he is writing that Nigama Kalpataru Galitam Phalam, that this Srimad Bhagavatam is Galitam Phalam, is the ripened fruit coming from the Vedic desire tree. Nigama Kalpataru Galitam Phalam Sukha Mukha Amritam Drava Samyutam. And because it is coming from the lotus mouth of Srila Sukadeva Goswami, it is Dravya. The word Dravya, Prabhupada translates in his word-for-word translation, Dravya means semi-solid and easily digestible or easily swallowable. Just like we heard recently, one example that His Holiness Bhakti Charan Maharaj, he was explaining, that we have a mother bird, and the mother bird has little baby birds. And the mother bird would go, fly off in the distance to get some food for her children. And it will pick up some bugs or insects. And after coming back to the nest, before directly giving that food to the baby birds, the mother bird would first chew the prey in her mouth and make it into a semi-solid state, because if she gives it directly, the food as it is to the little children, and because they're very small, they won't be able to chew it and digest it on their own. So the mother bird, out of compassion to help her children be able to eat that food, she would first chew the food herself, make it into a semi-solid state, and then give that to the children so the children can easily digest. Even in, like as humans, we have like baby food you can buy in the market, and the baby food would be, like some gooey thing, something that's semi-solid. It won't be fully water, it won't be fully solid. If you give babies some hard stuff, they can't chew because they're not fully developed. So you make mash some vegetables up together and make it into semi-solid state so the baby can easily take. So in the same way, Prabhupada is explaining that in that translation, Prabhupada is saying Dravya means semi-solid and easily soluble. And the Prabhupada explains that Sukadeva Goswami, when he is speaking this Bhagavatam, he is packaging the message of Bhagavatam in such a way that his audience in the future, in Kali Yuga, they can easily swallow it. They can easily swallow it and digest it. And Prabhupada explains that this is the duty. This is also the responsibility of all acharyas. This is the responsibility of all preachers. That being chaste to the spiritual master doesn't mean you just repeat everything as it is, like exactly word for word, but you keep the message intact, you keep the essence of the message intact, but also it is your responsibility to package the message in a way that it will be attractive to your audience, in a way that the audience can easily digest it and take it. So this is also the responsibility. So it's not like, again, going back to the example of the mother bird, it's not the responsibility of mother bird is to fetch the food, but it's also her responsibility to make the food into a condition by which the baby birds can take it. And this is the compassion of the mother bird. So in the same way, the preacher should be compassionate enough to think of ways in which he can make the message of Bhagavatam attractive to the general mass of people and easily digestible. And this is the compassion of the preacher. Sometimes, one time, some disciples of Prabhupada, they came to Prabhupada and they asked Prabhupada, how is it that you're able to come up with so many amazing analogies and metaphors, in your books? Like, you have like endless amount of examples, analogies for different topics. How you're able to think of all these different things? And then what was Prabhupada's response? Prabhupada explained, I'm able to think of all this because day and night I'm simply thinking about this and nothing else. So Prabhupada was explaining to his disciples that just to help us understand we're not the body and we're the soul, day and night Prabhupada in his mind, he explains that he's just simply thinking of what other example I can give, what other metaphor I can give to help these souls of this world understand this principle, understand this topic. So this is the mood of a preacher or a devotee of Lord, that he's always thinking, what example I can give to help my audience understand this, what metaphor I can give, how can I package it so they can easily understand it, how can I package it so they can easily take to it. And this extra effort the preacher puts, this extra endeavor the preacher puts, this is the compassion of the preacher, this is the compassion of the Vaishnava. If the preacher doesn't do this, okay, he can still be given credit of being chaste and repeating the message as it is, but higher than this preacher is that preacher who, out of compassion, he tries to package the message in a way it will be attractive. So this is the example of someone who is being an ideal chaste devotee of his Guru Maharaj and repeating the message as it is, but in a way that is attractive to the mass of people. On the other side, we have, in terms of unchastity, we have the example of Vallabha Acharya. We were hearing recently in the Navadvip Dham lectures how previously Vallabha Acharya, he was Vishnu Swami, the founder of Rudra Sampradaya, and Vishnu Swami, he comes to Rudra Dvip in Navadvip Dham, and there Lord Shiva, being very pleased with his bhajan, Lord Shiva comes and gives Vishnu Swami his darshan. And being pleased with Vishnu Swami, Lord Shiva, he asks, please ask for a boon. And Vishnu Swami says that I want to start my own sampradaya, glorifying the precepts of Bhakti Yoga. Can you please bless me so I can start my own sampradaya? And then Shiva says, yes, I'll initiate you, and by my blessings you'll have your own sampradaya. And Shiva even blesses him by saying that your sampradaya will be named after me. Your sampradaya will be called the Rudra Sampradaya. And this way Shiva leaves, and then later on, Vishnu Swami, he sees Mahaprabhu himself in Rudradvip. And Mahaprabhu tells him that in the future you will come as Vallabhacharya and you will participate in my pastimes. And we heard during those classes, Ghanshyam Prabhu was quoting from Anchal Leela, how through Vallabhacharya in CC, Mahaprabhu, he teaches many lessons. For example, how one should not have pride, and how, again, the same point of how one shouldn't be unchaste to the previous spiritual masters. So Vallabhacharya, he had great pride in his scholarship. So much so, at one instance, he comes up to Mahaprabhu with his commentary of Bhagavatam, and his commentary of Bhagavatam wasn't based on what the previous acharyas were saying. Just like Prabhupada, when he was compiling or translating the Srimad Bhagavatam, he would have some big book with all the different commentaries of different acharyas. Commentaries by Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur, commentaries by Jiva Goswami, Srila Sanatana Goswami, and so on. And Prabhupada would look and study all the commentaries of different acharyas, and then he would give his own purport in line with the previous acharyas. So this is being chaste to the previous spiritual masters. But this Vallabhacharya, because he was so proud of his learning and scholarship, one time he comes to Mahaprabhu and he presents his commentary about him, and he very proudly boasts that, just see Mahaprabhu, I have refuted the previous commentaries of Srila Sridhar Swami, and I'm giving my own commentary. And Mahaprabhu, when he hears this, he smiles and he chastises subtly to Vallabhacharya by saying that one who is unchaste to the Swami, one who rejects the Swami, I consider as a prostitute. So Mahaprabhu, he's playing with the words. In Vedic culture, the word Swami would be used by the wife to address her husband. So the wife would address her husband as Swami, and the husband would address the wife as Devi in Vedic culture. So in this instance, Mahaprabhu, he is giving the example, just like if a chaste wife rejects her Swami, rejects her husband and goes away and takes shelter of another man, you would consider that lady to be a prostitute. In the same way, that person who's rejecting the previous acharyas like Sridhar Swami and is just coming up with his own interpretations of Srimad Bhagavatam, I consider to be just as good as a prostitute. So in this way, Mahaprabhu, he very nicely and also heavily, in one sense, he chastises Vallabhacharya. So this is, and he's given as an example of someone who's being unchaste to the previous spiritual master. So whatever we're supposed to speak, it should be in line with the previous authorities. We can't do like what Vallabhacharya is doing, rejecting what the previous acharyas are saying and coming up with his own interpretations. If one does this, Mahaprabhu says that this is just as good as being a prostitute. Now in terms of chastity, there are some examples given in the Bhagavatam of different very powerful Vaishnavis. One example given is of Mother Devahuti in 3rd canto. Towards the end of this same canto, we'll read. And from these examples of these chaste Vaishnavis, we can learn the principle of how is it we should, in a similar mood, surrender to our spiritual masters. In the case of Mother Devahuti, it's mentioned that although she was a great princess coming, Manu was her father, so she was a great royal princess, but now she's married to Kardama Muni. And living in the forest, she lives a very austere lifestyle. And she becomes so absorbed in service to her husband, Kardama Muni, it's given that she completely neglects taking care of her own body. So much so that her body becomes completely emaciated. Her hair becomes all over the place, matted, and she just completely forgets to take care of her body. So much so, one day Kardama Muni looks at her wife and he gets this realization, he's just completely astonished that what has happened to my wife, She was a princess and now she's completely emaciated, she's completely neglected taking care of her body. And at that time, Kardama Muni, he gets completely overcome by compassion. His heart gets completely moved by Mother Devahuti that, my wife, she's so dedicatedly been serving me for so many years, that so much so that being so absorbed in her service, she's even sacrificed her own body. That body which is the most dear. So the most dear thing to all of us is our own body. But that thing which is most dear to the soul, she is sacrificing simply for my sake, simply for my service. In this way, Kardama Muni, he becomes completely moved, and being overcome by compassion, Kadamba Muni, he blesses Mother Devahuti with whatever spiritual credits, it's explained in Bhagavatam, whatever spiritual credits or mystic abilities Kadamba Muni had acquired by his tapasya and penance, he gave all those credits to her. He gave all those credits to his own wife, Mother Devahuti. And in the purport to that text, Prabhupada explains in Bhagavatam that just like Mother Devahuti, although spiritually speaking she wasn't very advanced, although spiritually speaking she was weak and not so advanced, still because she very focusedly, very in great absorption served her husband with so much dedication, she was able to acquire whatever spiritual credits, whatever spiritual abilities her husband had acquired. In the same way, if a disciple might be a very neophyte disciple, he might not be very much advanced in spiritual life. But if the disciple in the same mood, in the same dedication, forgetting his own personal desires, his own personal sense gratification, if the disciple in the same way, with great dedication, if the disciple serves his spiritual master, then although that disciple might be very low in terms of spiritual realization, by the results of his dedication to serving his spiritual master, the spiritual master will be so pleased with him, will be so moved, that whatever spiritual credits the spiritual master has acquired, all the spiritual credits the spiritual master will helplessly or with great love just bestow upon that disciple, and this way the disciple can also become very advanced in spiritual life. So in this way we can learn this example from Mother Devahuti, this principle of being dedicated to the service of the Guru, so much so that one forgets about his own life, about his own needs, his own sense gratification. Another thing we can learn is absorption. Mother Devahuti, she was so absorbed in her service, it's given that she forgot to take care of herself. In one lecture, His Holiness Radhanath Maharaj, he was asked this question, that Maharaj, if you can describe Krishna consciousness in one word, what would that one word be? And what was Maharaj's response? Maharaj responded that the one word by which we can describe Krishna consciousness in total is the word absorption. And if you think about it, like this point was coming to me, that while we were studying Nectar of Devotion, as we go higher and higher into the higher stages of bhakti, like bhava and prema, the degree of absorption of the particular devotee in Krishna becomes more and more intense. Like in bhava, in the stage of bhava, the devotee is completely so much absorbed that just by hearing one verse of Bhagavatam, he goes completely into ecstasy, starts shedding tears, and then prema, the absorption becomes more and more intense. So much so, like we see in the Antya Leela of Chaitanya Charitamrita, that Mahaprabhu, he will be so absorbed in Krishna that he will just see a tree, and just by seeing the dark colored trunk of a tree, he will be immediately reminded of Krishna, and he will go embrace that tree, thinking that tree is Krishna. Or he will go to the ocean, and just by seeing the waters of the ocean, he will be immediately reminded of Mother Yamuna, and he will go jump into the ocean. Or just by seeing a great hill of sand, he would immediately be reminded of Govardhan Hill, and he will immediately go start running towards those sand dunes. So in this way, we can see that the more and more absorbed one becomes in devotional service, the more and more absorbed one's meditation goes in Krishna, the more and more one advances in bhakti. And this absorption is something we should cultivate in taking shelter of our spiritual master's instructions. Prabhupada, many times he told his disciples that in terms of physical association with my spiritual master, His Holiness Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, that in terms of physical association, it was very little. But, although initially I had very little association with him, I was never alone. Right throughout my Grahastha times, for so many decades, and even now when I'm preaching, I'm always there with my spiritual master through his Vani. So in this way we can see Prabhupada's absorption in the instructions of his spiritual master. We study Lilamrit, the first volume, we will see how after being instructed by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur to preach this message in the Western world, it's not that Prabhupada only later on, when he became very old physically, when he was 50 or 60 or 70 years old, only then did Prabhupada start contemplating or thinking of how can I preach this in the Western world. No, right from the start, from that day one, Prabhupada was always planning and contemplating, how can I preach this in the Western world? And if we study Lilamrit, we can see how right throughout his Grahastha life, Prabhupada was planning on how to spread this movement. Prabhupada was taking shelter or was becoming absorbed in that instruction of his spiritual master. And Prabhupada was translating Bhagavad Gita, writing his commentaries in this way. Throughout his whole life, Prabhupada was planning of how to carry out the instruction of his spiritual master. So in that same mood, we need to be also absorbed in the instructions of our spiritual master. Another example of chastity we see in the 9th canto of Bhagavatam. We see the story of Sukanya. So the story is given that one time there was a king, I forgot the king's name, but can you say it? Brishaparva. So this king Brishaparva, he's going with his daughter Sukanya, and they're going in the forest, and they're going to visit a great rishi named Chavanya Rishi. And as they're going through the forest, and along with her daughter Sukanya, she has a friend. So as we know in Vedic culture, the great princesses, they wouldn't be alone. Along with them, they would have many maidservants and many friends who would always be with them, and they would live happily in the palace. So they're going in the forest for a walk, and they're going to visit this great sage, Chavanya Rishi. And this princess, Sukanya, along with her friends, they start picking fruits from different trees, and they start enjoying the forest. And as they're picking different fruits and flowers from the trees, Sukanya, she notices that there's some holes in the ground, some earth holes, and she sees some shiny substance in these holes. And then being curious, and Bhagavatam explains, being induced by providence, by destiny, she just happens to take her finger and poke that glowing substance in that earth hole. And immediately when she puts her finger through that hole and pokes that glowing substance, immediately blood starts oozing out from that hole. And it's given after that, the king, the soldiers, the princess Sukanya, and all of her friends, all of them, they can't, or they become unable to pass stool and urine. And being put in such a uncomfortable position, the king immediately wonders, like, what has happened, that we can't, the urge to pass stool and urine is there, but we can't do. And so they're all in this very uncomfortable, awkward position. And immediately the king, because he's a Rajrishi, immediately being so sharp in Vedic intelligence, immediately understands. Definitely one of us must have committed some kind of aparad towards this sage, Chavanya Rishi, due to which this calamity is coming upon us, due to which we're suffering through this. Like we were explaining before, in 4th canto, Narad Muni explains to Dhruva Maharaj that whenever that as a reaction to us not properly dealing with other living entities, as a reaction to us not properly dealing with those who are higher than us, those who are on an equal level with us, and those who are on a lower level to us, one has to suffer the threefold miseries of mature existence. One has to suffer the trident of Mother Durga. So this great king, he knew this philosophy, that whenever any suffering comes, it's due to, one great reason for that could be is due to some aparad, or due to us not properly dealing with some great Vaishnava or great Rishi. And he understood that, okay, we're in the vicinity of this great sage's ashram, and suddenly we're being overcome by this great distress. Most likely, I think we've done something that has offended this Rishi. So then he asks all of his associates that, has any of you done something wrong, in this area? And then the princess, she submits or confesses that this is what I did. Then immediately the king understands that Chavanya Rishi, definitely he must have been in that hole, and when you poke that, you caused harm to this great sage. So immediately the king, he goes to that earth hole, and he offers apologies, and then Chavanya Rishi, he comes. And the king now is afraid that, okay, I might get cursed by this great sage for, due to my daughter doing this to him. And the king is very apologetic. And the Rishi, he just asked, Prabhupada writes in his purport that the Rishi, he asked this great king that, is your daughter married? He just asked this one question. And the king immediately understood that this great Rishi, he's interested in his daughter. And immediately the king, he offers a daughter to this great sage, and he leaves to pacify the great sage. Now the amazing thing is that this great Rishi, He's not like some young rishi, like some 20-year-old rishi or 30-year-old rishi, but according to the Bhagavatam, this rishi was old enough to be Sukanya's grandfather. And this rishi was so emaciated, it's given, that his skin was completely baggy. And he was like just about to pass away, he was like in the final years of his life. So, and he had gray hair, his skin was loose and his teeth was everywhere. So in this way, descriptions are given in Bhagavatam of how old this great sage Chavanya Rishi was. He was old enough to be Sukanya's grandfather. And now Sukanya, she's married off to this super old sage. And in Vedic culture, these unmarried princesses, they would be in their teenage years because they would be married early. So we can imagine Sukanya, she's just a teenager, 15, 16 years old. And now she's marrying this great sage who's like 80, 90 years old. But she doesn't complain. She just does her duty and she just faithfully accepts whatever her father says. And another thing we should understand, that as we're discussing before, along with her were all of her teenage friends. So in front of all of her friends, she was married off to this super old sage. So again, it's even more embarrassing for her. So if it was done secretly, she was married off to some old sage, it would be okay. But now on top of being married to the super old sage, her marriage is being conducted in front of all of her friends, teenage friends. So it's even more embarrassing for her. But she doesn't complain, she doesn't throw any tantrum or arguments. She just accepts whatever her father says, and she goes and marries off to this super old sage. Now another thing the Bhagavatam explains, not only is this sage so old, but also this sage is very easily irritated, and very easily the sage becomes angry and frustrated. So it's given that as Sukanya would serve this great sage, that the sage having a short temper would, just for small mistakes would chastise Sukanya for small mistakes in her duties. But still the Bhagavatam explains that Sukanya was still so chaste to this great sage that she continued on in her duties very faithfully, very chastely, serving him. And in one verse, Bhagavatam explains that she served her husband, Chavanya Rishi, by understanding his mood and temperament. According to his mood and temperament, she was serving Chavanya Rishi. So this is another instruction we can take in serving or being chaste to our spiritual masters, that we understand the mood or the temperament of theirs, and we act accordingly to be a source of pleasure for them. And it's given that the spiritual master, he can be as soft as a rose and as heavy as a thunderbolt. But when that thunderbolt comes, Prabhupada explains, we should take that thunderbolt to be the special mercy of the spiritual master. Because the spiritual master, he'll only give that thunderbolt, he'll only give that severe chastisement only to those disciples who could handle it. If the spiritual master knows that a certain disciple, his faith in me is not so strong, then naturally the spiritual master, he would be hesitant to severely chastise that disciple, understanding that if I severely correct him or chastise him, then because his faith is not so strong in me, he will just run away. Or he'll reject my instruction and commit further Vaishnava prad towards me, and he'll go further away from Krishna. But if a certain disciple has great faith and relationship with the spiritual master, then the spiritual master, out of mercy, he can give that heavy chastisement, he can give that thunderbolt, understanding that this disciple, he can take or he can handle this chastisement. So in this way, Prabhupada explains that whenever any chastisement or reprimand comes from the spiritual